Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost, your weekly look at the world of business and economics on Al Jazeera. This week, banking billions from poor countries. A G20 debt deal for low-income nations to cope with the pandemic has really failed to live up to expectations. And not only are rich countries benefiting, private investors are refusing to take part and are cashing in. Also this week, a setback for the fight against forced and child labour. It's on the rise, and it's Western consumers and brands to blame as factories in the manufacturing hubs try to keep up with demand. And we'll take you to Colombia, notorious as the world's largest supplier of cocaine, and now with designs to become the biggest exporter of medical marijuana. You know, this pandemic was always going to hit poorer countries harder. I think we can safely say that. And we're not just talking about infections and deaths, it's everything else. It's businesses closing, it's economies slowing, it's recoveries stalled. And so last year, the G20 launched an initiative to suspend debt repayments, just to give a little breathing room. But according to debt campaigners who've crunched the IMF and World Bank data, the program has fallen well short of expectations. So let's do some number crunching of our own, starting with the 46 low-income countries which applied to the scheme but still ended up paying out $36.4 billion. Only $10.3 billion in debt payments were actually suspended. So where's the real debt relief? Especially when the G20 group of rich countries had promised the scheme would lead to more than $20 billion in savings. Now, interestingly, China, which has often been criticised for an unwillingness to offer debt relief, actually suspended the most debt. This is according to the Jubilee Debt Campaign. You know, the World Bank warned this month the pandemic had increased the debt burden of low-income countries by 12%. It's up at $860 billion in 2020. It seems one of the biggest problems with the whole G20 plan was that private investors weren't compelled to take part. In fact, they took in $14.9 billion themselves during the pandemic. It's all a bit familiar, isn't it? Let's give you a specific example now. Chad. The country's president was killed by rebels in April and has seen many years of conflict across its porous borders. Now, both the IMF and World Bank called out private investors and warned, and this is a quote, "a crisis could further impoverish an already poor country, worsen healthcare and endanger regional peace and security," end quote. In this case, the private investor group is led by the Anglo-Swiss commodities trader Glencore. Together, they're owed more than $1 billion, which is a third of Chad's public external debt under an oil-for-cash deal. Now, for its part, Glencore, in a letter to the IMF obtained by this network, says it has restructured loans collectively with other creditors in 2015, and again, quote, as a significant and standalone gesture of goodwill in 2018. Glencore goes on to say it was engaging with Chad in a constructive and good faith manner following a request for talks from the country. Well, I mentioned the Jubilee Debt Campaign earlier, and Tim Jones is the head of policy there. He's with us on Skype from London to talk through more of this. Tim, thanks for your time. I just want to deal specifically with Chad first of all. A few quick questions on that. Why is Glencore dragging its feet on this particular issue?
It's outrageous that they are dragging their feet. They urgently need to cancel the debt. They are a private company and they appear to be seeking to make as much money as they can rather than care about the interests of the people of Chad.
Is there anything that Chad and or the G20 can do to actually get these private investors to ease their debt?
Chad could just refuse to pay and put the pressure on Glencore that way. The G20 could politically and financially support Chad to do so. And the G20, in particular the UK and US, could change the law to make it easier or to force Glencore to restructure the debt. The debts are owed to UK part of Glencore and other lenders, and the UK is the governing legal system for most international debts that are part of the G20 schemes.
And how did, just as background for our viewers, Chad get indebted to Glencore in the first place? And I should point out other countries as well, this whole idea of the oil for cash schemes.
Yeah, so there were loans in 2013 and 2014 from Glencore, which were effectively providing money up front in return for Chad giving money out of its oil revenues to Glencore. And then when the price of oil fell, that meant that most of the money that Chad was earning from the oil was going to Glencore when it needed that money to finance its plans under its budgets. So then Glencore lent this money. We don't know where it went. But Chad has never been able to meet the payments on it. The debt has already been restructured twice. The last time in 2018, we said it was far too little. It was just moving payments into the future, and that we would end up in this situation again where there would be a need for another change in the terms. This time, the debt needs to be properly reduced and cancelled down to a properly sustainable level.
Okay, so let's talk more widely about this whole G20 debt relief scheme. This is incredibly cynical of me to ask, but I think it's fair enough to ask. Are you at all surprised that this didn't pan out as advertised? That the idea of the G20 swooping in and saying, right, we're going to cancel debt, we're going to make this easier, and it didn't happen? What do you know?
I am surprised that the G20 scheme has led to less than a quarter of debt payments being suspended and that no debt has been restructured. When the G20 started this scheme in April 2020, it was almost a surprise that they did it, that they acted so quickly at the start of the pandemic. And so we did have great hopes that it would do what it said it would do, which was to suspend all the debt payments to other governments and to private lenders. And the other governments bit has possibly largely happened, but no debt payments have been suspended to private creditors. The G20 have left them off the hook, which has put a massive hole in the scheme, has led to billions of dollars of debt still being paid during a time of crisis, and has made money for those private lenders. They've effectively been bailed out because the suspension of payments to other governments has allowed private creditors to keep being paid. So it's been an outrageous failure of the G20 that they haven't lived up to what they said they would do in April 2020.
Did the IMF's special drawing rights not help? I should explain briefly, that they are essentially money. They're not hard currency, but it is supplementary money for a member state. 650 billion worth of those, did that not make a difference?
Yeah, well, that was much more recently. So that issuance of those reserves has helped, but only since August 2021, which is a long way into the pandemic, almost 18 months. So that is money that countries do now have to spend. One of the problems, though, is that because of the lack of action on debt, a lot of that money will just end up being spent on paying off private creditors. And so it will end up being just another scheme to bail out private lenders and pay high interest rates to them, rather than be spent in countries on expanding health coverage, supporting economies and helping the recovery. And
weren't they, the special drawing rights, dependent on austerity and debt restructuring anyway?
Yeah, so this is a big problem now that we have the IMF is largely telling countries that they have to implement austerity, and looking across the board, we're seeing big cuts in public spending coming over the next few years, just when we need public spending more than ever to tackle the climate emergency, to meet the sustainable development goals and to recover from the pandemic. And it's debt restructuring and cancellation is one of the ways that we can stop that austerity. So if countries had debts cancelled, that would free up the money that they'd be able to expand public spending now rather than cut back.
Just a quick word on the UK, seeing as you are there in London. There was a situation, I believe, where the UK talked about issuing these type of assets, these special drawing rights, to low-income countries, which sounds good. But hasn't the UK also talked about cutting aid in other areas to a lot of countries? I mean, is that just rebalancing the books?
Yeah, the UK has cut aid spending by almost a third so far since the pandemic began. And it's going to cut it even further through massaging the figures over the next year. One of the ways that it's doing this is that Sudan is finally qualifying for an old debt cancellation scheme on debts that go back decades. Most of the debt owed to the UK and Western countries is actually made up. It comes from charging interest rates of over 10% for the last 35 years. When they cancel that debt, they then claim that that is somehow aid money, and then they can claim that meets their targets and so cut aid elsewhere. And the UK has just announced it's planning to do that next year, which will knock another $800 million off the UK aid budget next year on top of over $6-7 billion that's already been cut.
Tim Jones talking debt with us this week on Counting the Cost. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another feature, if I can say that, of the pandemic was the government furlough programs, which allowed people basically to keep their jobs. And while many people in Western economies have been lucky enough to do that and now even give up work for greener pastures, the same can't be said for many trapped in employment in developing countries. Just as the pandemic exposed cracks in healthcare services, it also exposed concerns in the global supply chain. And many manufacturing hubs have come in for greater scrutiny over forced labour, child labour and humanitarian crises, from Xinjiang in China to Tigray in Ethiopia. Here are the numbers. More than 40 million people are victims of forced labour across the world, trapped in jobs which they were coerced or deceived into. Now, this is interesting. A total of 152 million children, 64 million girls and 88 million boys are in child labour globally, accounting for almost 1 in 10 of all children worldwide. And according to the International Labour Organization, the economic crisis caused by the pandemic is expected to contribute to global unemployment of more than 200 million people next year, with women and youth workers the worst hit. 5 years of progress towards the eradication of working poverty has been undone because of this pandemic. And in our case study from India, school closures have forced yet more children into work. This report is from Elizabeth Puranam in Firozabad in Uttar Pradesh state.
These are the youngest journalists in the city of Firozabad. They're working on the next edition of their unique magazine. Balwani Bachcho Ki Awaaz, or The Voice of Children, is a magazine by and for young people about child labour and their rights.
The stories that we write for the magazine are all related to children and inform readers about the reality of our town. When we share these stories with government officials, it helps them understand the difficulties that children face.
14-year-old Kamini has been contributing to the magazine for 2 years. She lives in an impoverished area of Firozabad where entire families are employed in the glass bangles industry. She convinced one neighbour to stop her 3 daughters aged between 9 and 12 from working and send them to school instead.
We have 5 children and no one to help us. So when we were in financial difficulty, we asked the children to work. A lot of children here work, and at home our children started helping us when we were going through a rough patch.
Sarita Devi sent her children back to school when her husband recovered from an illness and could work again, but not everyone would do the same. Firozabad's glass bangles industry is 200 years old, and the factories are known for their poor working conditions. Generations of families have been employed in the trade, although many work from home. When we walk through these narrow lanes of Firozabad, we can see many children making bangles. Rights groups say school closures because of coronavirus and then an outbreak of dengue fever mean more children are forced to work because they don't have access to online learning. In this home, children as young as 6 sit in front of small flames, using the heat to join broken glass bangles. They do this for up to 8 hours a day. Child labour is illegal in India, but rights groups say it's difficult to stop those working at home.
We had child labour 10 million in 2011. I'm doubling it only and primarily because of COVID as well. So I think what we can say, coronavirus has been impacting the world over. But in India, the issues that we always had have amplified to an extent, which is actually quite scary.
The release of this year's Voice of Children magazine has been delayed due to lockdowns, but Kamini and her team are now putting the final touches on the issue, knowing their work has never been more important.
Okay, let's talk more about this with Sofia Nazalya, who's the Asia Human Rights Analyst with the risk consultancy group Verisk Maplecroft. Sophia's with us on Skype from Singapore today. Sofia, thanks for your time. How badly has this pandemic pushed back any progress that has been made?
Well, thanks very much for having me. Well, annually we publish a human rights outlook looking at key trends, key human rights risks impacting businesses today. So we measure 12 labor rights issues across 198 countries around the world. And what we found in the past 5 years is that labor rights has been on the decline. So we're thinking of issues, very pertinent rights issues such as forced labor and child labor. There's been quite a significant decline in that. But as well, to a lesser extent, other human rights issues such as, occupational health and safety, clearly a pertinent issue in the time of the pandemic, as well as decent work, decent wages, decent working hours, and the like. And the pandemic has certainly exacerbated this issue, which is really why it's a critical moment for companies to be looking at their supply chain issues and where their most pertinent labor rights risks lie.
And is it just as important, because you can focus on the businesses and their exploitative practices, but is it just as important for us as a consumer to know where things are coming from and then make our own decisions based on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the concept of sustainability, it's no longer just a concept. It's not just a buzzword that's thrown around. I think a lot of consumers now are wanting companies to put their money where their mouth is, to really walk the talk in terms of responsible sourcing and ethical procurement. So we're seeing this not just with consumers, but investors and shareholders are more and more looking at the social aspect and the social performance of what companies are doing. And I think as consumers, clearly there is a lot of room there for companies to be making decisions based on consumer demand. I think a lot of brand loyalty is dependent on whether companies are able to, secure ethically procured labor. So yeah, it's definite. There's a lot of scope there in terms of consumer choices.
So let's talk about some specific countries, and there's actually just some pictures I want to show to our viewers. First of all, Malaysia, which interestingly the United States has decided to ban the import of surgical gloves, which is such an important thing for these last 18 months because of issues over forced labour in the manufacture of those. Now that's just one example. I was reading with your research as well, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, they're considered extreme risk now. What's put them on extreme risk?
Our report really looks at the decline in very key sourcing locations across Asia. You've mentioned a few of them there. These 4 countries that you've mentioned, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia, they're very key sourcing locations, especially for the garment industry. And what we found is that, the key drivers behind this downgrade in scores is really the intensification of on-the-ground violations and the poorer standards of enforcement of labor standards. So when we're assessing these risks, essentially we're measuring modern slavery by way of our modern slavery index. So this is where the extreme risk categorization comes in. And essentially, when we're looking at these 4 countries, there are a lot of examples put into the garment sector that shows this decline in rights, right? With the pandemic, factory closures and so on, workers are facing unstable hours, insecure payment of wages. In some instances, they're not even being paid at all. So for these reasons, they're driving the downgrade in scores for modern slavery in these countries.
Okay, a couple of other places can you tell me about? First of all, Xinjiang in China, which we hear about a lot. Human rights abuse is well documented there. How much of a concern is that becoming for manufacturing and business?
Yeah, absolutely. Xinjiang is an issue that is not going away, clearly. International scrutiny, both in the sense of emerging legislation, sanctions targeting specific commodities, whether it's cotton or agricultural products arising out of Xinjiang, or, in terms of increasing scrutiny by investors, expectations of companies to enhance their social performance, all that leads to a very difficult situation for companies that are currently either based in Xinjiang or have operations or supply chain links in Xinjiang. When they're thinking of either moving operations to elsewhere in the region or completely divesting from China, what is key is that companies have to assess the other risks that do exist in Asian sourcing locations. Forced labor risks do exist within Xinjiang, but as our report shows, labor rights issues across Asia is still a pertinent issue, whether it comes to child labor or other serious violations.
And so supply chains, you mentioned that there. This is the last thing I wanted to ask you about. We have heard a lot about supply chains recently, more in a sort of first world problems way. I'm more interested in how the pandemic has affected a company or a brand's ability to track a supply chain and to keep an eye on these very serious issues which we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, the pandemic has certainly negatively affected how companies are able to track and monitor their supply chains. I mean, for very obvious reasons, right? I mean, when we look at the disruptions across the board, whether it's, not being able to travel on site to conduct on-the-ground audits, or even to reach out and have a direct connection or direct line to workers. All these things are being hampered by the pandemic. One thing that companies can do is have local stakeholders perform that function. But in the absence of that, it's really important for companies to be able to have access to credible data that allows them to look at their supply chain risks, their labor rights issues, without actually having to be present on the ground.
Sofia Nazalya is from Verisk Maplecroft joining us on Counting the Costs. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much.
Finally to Colombia, which is well known as the world's largest supplier of cocaine. And now it's got another drug in its sights, marijuana. President Ivan Duque has for the first time allowed international export of the marijuana flower. And legal experts believe Colombia could become the leading exporter of medical cannabis in the world. And that, in turn, could offer more opportunities for Colombian businesses, as Alessandro Rampietti found out in the town of Pesca.
A sea of medical-grade marijuana grows at this farm in central Colombia. 18 hectares of plants equivalent to 25 football pitches that Clever Leaves, a Colombian company with US investors, grows with the highest quality standards. Every step of the process adheres to strict hygiene protocols. Each plant is traced with a QR code.
But I think it's a good opportunity. It's a great opportunity.
An example, says the company's president, of how Colombia is changing its attitude towards drugs after decades of fighting against the illegal drug trade.
Colombia, had a brand within the marijuana, call it illegal marijuana industry. And one of the things we as a company were committed to was to change that image from Colombia into something positive, into something that brought science, that brought benefits to patients, that brought benefits to people who work around the cannabis.
Benefits that could also bring huge profits. Growing marijuana here is 4 times cheaper than in Canada or the US. Colombia could capture 1/5 of the global market, $8 billion a year, more than the country's exports of flowers and coffee combined.
Of course, we have tropical growing conditions. That means we have everything that greenhouses elsewhere are trying to emulate. We have them here for free. 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness every day, year-round.
It's no surprise that President Ivan Duque came here to announce the country will begin exporting dried cannabis flowers.
Just a few years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine being in a legal marijuana field in Colombia, and now everybody is trying to get a piece of the action. Governments have been promoting this business as a great opportunity for post-conflict Colombia, but many fear big players will squeeze out local growers that are not backed by big cash.
Farmers in remote areas that have long made a living growing marijuana illegally say the high cost of getting into the legal market and the security issues have left them out of the current bonanza.
Since the beginning, the regulation of medical marijuana was a big company model. It was big pharma and export-based. There's strong barriers and exclusions for small growers, despite them being the ones that paved the way for the business years ago. And now companies with great lobbying power are taking advantage of that.
Other smaller companies say staying afloat is tough, as they focus on the few beauty and health products so far allowed nationally.
The cost of producing and maintaining medical cannabis is extremely high for small companies that can't depend on a national market. If Colombia would also bet on developing a dynamic internal industry, then families that have invested their savings in this might have a chance.
There is irony in the fact that a country so often associated with drug trafficking could become a powerhouse of exporting drugs legally. The risk, though, is that this new boom will remain in few powerful hands. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera Pesca.
And that is our show for this week, but I want to know what you think, what you want to see on the show as well. You can tweet or DM me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC as well, or you can email as well. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. And there's plenty more for you online as well at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. All our past episodes are up there for you to watch whenever you'd like. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.